All right, let's go on now to the displacement report, and then we'll do the water report after that, and then we'll do the pulled items. Are we doing executive session today? 2 items. Okay.
Mayor and Council.
Congratulations on the naming of the Frisbee course in the park, and immortality here in the city of Austin. Go ahead.
Mayor and Council, I am Erica Leek, Acting Assistant Director of the Neighborhood Housing Department, and it's my pleasure to introduce, as though many of you already know, the co-chairs of the Anti-Displacement Task Force, Nefertiti Jackman and Raul Alvarez, and they're going to provide a very high-level summary of their recommendations, but we also just passed out the full recommendations, which were also sent out to Mayor and Council yesterday, so they can certainly entertain any questions you may have.
My name is Nefertiti Jackman. I'll just introduce myself briefly. I first of all want to say thank you, Mayor Adler, for appointing me to the task force and being able to serve on behalf of the city of Austin on a challenging issue, both for Austin and many cities across the nation, and also serve as executive director of Six Square and council member for Houston's district. Thank you.
And good morning, Mayor and Council, City Manager, and thanks for the invitation to present and just to serve in this capacity. It was a long journey, and I think we got to a good place, but it was a little rocky at the beginning, but it's a tough issue, you know, as you all know, but a very important one, and I would be remiss if I didn't say thank you to the City Mayor and Council and the City Manager for the recognition, you know, in terms of the dedication last week of the disc golf course, and I mean the fact that it's a disc golf course is a very special thing to me, and we can talk offline about why that is. But you know, it's kind of mixed feelings at first about it, just because you don't do community service for recognition, you know, you do it to help people, and so. But it wasn't until I saw my family and how proud they were. They came literally from the four corners for the dedication, so it was a special moment and thing to share with them, and so it kind of made sense once that happened. Is that, oh, it's not for me, it's for them, and for the kids that were there, kind of playing disc golf. So, so thank you for that. Very special, something I'll never forget. And one of these days, if you want to play around, you know, I'd be happy to guide you through it. And then also, if I would be remiss if I didn't recognize the CAN reps from the city of Austin, Councilmember Renteria and Councilmember Flanagan, right, for serving, and also, again, Councilmember Renteria and Mayor Adler for being at the dedication last week since it was Thanksgiving week, and really kind of made an effort to be there and share some very special words. And I think Councilmember Houston served on the CAN board as well. And I think so did Ann Kitchen a while back, right? So that's who I represent on the task force, and I was kind of just, you know, was kind of selected by the group of 17 people. So it was a pretty big group of people. It was more than just your typical 11-member task force, and Ms. Jackman and I were selected to facilitate the process, and I think we got to a good place, and it's a pretty exhaustive and list of things, but what we're going to try to do is not go into every specific suggestion, but just show that there's a framework sort of behind this, because you can look at it and start looking at how much is that going to cost and how much is that going to cost, and we can't do all of it, and But I think the idea is that we can take action in a bunch of different areas, right, that are highlighted, and that the important thing is that we take action. That's why it's not called a final report. It's called recommendations for action, right, because part of what we heard from the community was a frustration in terms of addressing the issue. And so we hope this report kind of helps us move forward and bring the issue kind of to the front burner again, although I know a lot of folks, on this council are very strong advocates for housing and for addressing this issue in particular. So we're going to just kind of start by summarizing the process a little bit and summarizing the report, and then just having a dialogue with you for as long as you're willing to talk. So did you want to take the first page?
Sure. Basically, we started with a group of 17 members that were appointed by both Mayor Adler and City Council, and our charge included 5 key areas for action, which included preserving and expanding the supply of affordable housing throughout Austin, controlling land for community development, preserving and growing small businesses and cultural assets, and helping residents increase income and expand assets. And also with that, we were charged with identifying financial strategies to ensure that all of the recommendations could be funded.
And just a little bit about the process. I think we had our first meeting sometime in December of last year to launch the process. We met monthly and received briefings on a variety of issues. We had 3 public forums, one in Central East Austin, one in kind of Northeast Austin, and one in Southeast Austin, to get feedback on the issues that are more particular to those areas. We reviewed recommendations from reports that are related to this issue from going back to 2000, and there's no shortage of reports that are related to this issue. So thank you to the city auditor for helping us kind of sort through that a little bit. And part of the challenge with this issue is that a lot of the things that you all are dealing with in real time are issues that relate to displacement, and so we were being asked to weigh in on current events without having a set of formal recommendations yet. And so you did get some feedback from us on the People's Plan and the soccer stadium, and I think we were about to do a Code Next suggestion or recommendation, but when that got pulled, that was not adopted by the task force. We had 4 work groups that were developed or that were established, right, to kind of come up with recommendations, and that's why you see the 4 different sections, of the report. And finally, the task force finalized its recommendations November 9th. We took the next week to, again, based on our conversation on the 9th, really to revise the report and make sure everyone's comments were integrated. And then and the reason that this is not such a fancy PowerPoint is because the next week was Thanksgiving week. So you get lots of words and no pictures in this PowerPoint. And before moving on to the summary of the report, I do, again, because you're going to see the report and it's over 100 recommendations. And I think part of the message, I think, for us is and the next section, I think, is the framework that we'd like for you to kind of focus on a little bit in terms of the things that are important, right? And most of these recommendations will fall under one of these points in the framework. But part of it is that, it's a framework for making Austin not the capital of just Texas, but the capital of diversity, inclusion, and equity. And if you look at the narrative in the report, right, in the beginning and at the end of the report, you see that that's really what we're after here, is how do we make Austin more inclusive and more equitable. And that's, in the spirit of the work that the Mayor's Task Force on Institutional Racism and Systemic Inequities is doing, but it's how do we put this issue of displacement in a broader context, right? And so you'll see that some of these recommendations may seem unrelated or tangents, but just kind of know that that's the overall framework and the view that the task force took, that it's important not just for what we're dealing with now as a community, but because of the historical dynamic that occurs that led to this point in time, and you can't ignore that historical legacy. So that's just before we get into the kind of those bullet points on the framework, wanted to give that context.
And just following up with Raul said, I think it is very important, and it was important for the task force to understand, to put some of the people who have been most impacted when developing and crafting the policies and recommendations, considering the most vulnerable of Austin's citizens and population. And although Raul and I both represent organizations that are based in East Austin, where we're facing, according to the UT report, some of the greatest pressures from displacement, our concern was also looking at cities or communities throughout Austin so that they don't face the same outcomes as East Austin. So some of the major, the themes of the recommendations were, we included recommendations to expand public expenditures for housing affordability dedicated to low-income households, coupled with carefully crafted density increases. And thankfully, the bond issue passed, so we have some of the financial resources available to address many of the recommendations that are in here. And then there was also adopting government initiatives to produce more affordable housing and provide housing access across the city. We know it is not just the quantity, but it is the affordability of the houses, the housing stock that is important. Placing an equal emphasis on the preservation of affordable housing as we do on new construction as well. And I am also currently working with I can't remember the department, but it's the historic office with Kara Bertrand, identifying how we can create some historic districts to preserve other areas. So we all are looking at that continuing and engaging local business community and philanthropic institutions. And we do believe that the city has a responsibility to establish the policies, but there can be a bigger investment from our philanthropic organizations to support the crisis that we're in.
And just to kind of highlight a few more of the major themes, part of it is that we should have a legislative strategy, right, for some of the ways the legislature has limited us in terms of the tools that we've tried to use to address the issue, but then when we try to use them, then we're told you can't do it or we won't let you do it, which is unfortunate, but that doesn't mean we don't stop trying, right, to either regain that or ask for some kind of authority that we think will have an impact, right, that maybe has a better chance of making it through. And I know there our state delegation, is working on that, and the San Antonio delegation, too. There's a state rep from San Antonio that's really interested in this issue of displacement and trying to put forward some legislation. And taking intentional efforts to preserve the diverse cultural legacy in small businesses and community assets and cultural assets. I think that's the one thing that I want to commend the council on, right, is they didn't just say, tell us what to do about gentrification, right, or displacement, right? You literally kind of broke it down into home ownership or just affordable housing opportunities, because again, that's an interesting thing. I've been involved with this conversation for a couple of decades, and this is the first time we really bring in the issue of displacement of renters. So I do think there's an evolution here of the concept or the view of the issue, but also bringing in the small business issue, right? Because we know that as the demographics of a community change, the support for those business and other institutions also changes or wanes, and that limits their ability to remain also in the community. And of course, the cultural and historical assets, right, again, also suffer when you don't have the communities there who are supporting, right, those efforts and keeping those traditions alive. And then the last bullet, before we kind of just open it up for some discussion, is that there's kind of an engagement part of this, right? That it's not just kind of pointing the finger at somebody and saying, you do something, right? And we see a lot of that, in this town, and you're usually on the other end of the pointing, right? But I think that it's that it's kind of how do we do this in a way where you're engaging the impacted families, right? Whether they're renters or homeowners, but how are we proactive in reaching out and engaging them in a way that helps them find the resources they need? There's the issue of creating some resources, right, that maybe don't exist, but also even when we have the resources, how do we reach out to families to make sure they're taking advantage of the supports? And likewise, the small businesses, right? If we can support small businesses or cultural organizations, kind of what does that look like, and do they even know, that these supports are available? And that also that we want to engage philanthropic organizations, businesses, developers. It's not just a city issue, right? It's not just a county issue. We shouldn't look to the city and the county to solve this issue because it's so much broader than just one institution, and so we need to bring in businesses in different neighborhoods. We need to bring in developers. We need to bring in philanthropic institutions, and we need to bring in anyone who thinks this is a challenge or doesn't like what's happening, and creating avenues, for them to be able to be a part of something that's coordinated and integrated that can have an impact. So that's kind of a very, very broad overview. If kind of we want to get into specific sections, we can, although I guess we're more sort of focused on specific parts of the report, Ms. Jackman and I. But I do want to thank city staff who supported the process. City manager Rosie Trula was involved, and Mandy DeMeo, as well as Erica Leak and Matthew Ramirez. I do want to thank John Henneberger is here as well. He's one of the task force members. I'm not sure if there's any others, but thanks to the task force members for really kind of putting in a lot of time and very thoughtful approach to the issue, because I think the level of knowledge was and just commitment was off the charts, but I think we all came together, in the last 2 or 3 months and really kind of brought it home, as I'd say. So thanks everybody for your patience as folks who were trying to facilitate a process that I think got us to a good result, and that again we're happy to help answer any questions about sort of how we got here and sort of what some of these things mean. So,
well, first I want to thank the two of you for your leadership at the entire task force. This was a lot of work. And I recall that when this came before the council, when we created this task force, we were looking at the last 10 years of repeated attempts and initiatives by prior councils to take a look at this. I recall that the appendix, which was, I think, the Mayor Pro Tem initially created, that the staff then ended on, it was voluminous with respect to the past efforts. And the recurrent theme had always been, why is it that we do these studies and then something doesn't happen next? I think that it was incredibly valuable to have the task force go back through and pull all the things together and to categorize them the way that you've done in the report that you have generated, together with prioritizing the things and suggesting based on the work that you did where the greatest focus needs to be across other areas. So your work coincides with the work that was done by the People's Plan and their proposal. There was a resolution the council passed that asked staff to take a look and vet those ideas and let the strongest rise to the top. It also coincides with the work that the Mayor Pro Tem's office and my office have been involved in. We've been involved in with Policy Link, which has had a cohort of cities working with one another to compare anti-displacement initiatives and practices, trying to find what needs to or what could happen. And it also coincides with the work that the council did with the housing blueprint and the request of staff to tell us how we best implement that. And my understanding is, and if you could correct this, that all of these things seem to be coming together right now, including the question of the new housing bond that the community thankfully passed this past November, and that in February, as I understand it, staff's going to be wrapping their arms around all of these things, and then coming to council in February. Can you just so that we have that perspective, can you talk to us about what's going to happen next in that regard?
And if I could just kind of build on something you said real quick, we did try to be very thoughtful, again, about all these things that are kind of evolving or emerging as we were doing our work. But we did try to footnote the report where we had elements that related to the People's Plan, right? You may not see it word for word, but we tried to include sort of the specific sort of spirit and actions, I think, that were brought forward. And you'll find almost all of them there in some way, but they're footnoted in a way, or they're kind of referenced in the body of the recommendation. And we did the same thing with the UT report, the Uprooted report, because we knew we'd get questions about, did you review it, and which ones should we do? And so we did try to also note where we did pull from that report things that we thought were relevant and could have an impact, but we didn't include all of that, of course, even though that we have quite a few recommendations. But again, we try to be strategic given the framework, the way we were looking at the issue, what makes sense to pull from the People's Plan or from the UT report, and that's consistent with the task force members sort of were articulating. Thanks.
I saw that.
Sorry,
That was
Rosa.
helpful.
Hi, good morning. Rosie Truelove, Director, Neighborhood Housing and Community Development. Merrick, you give a really good summary of the things that we have on our plate. If you look at these individually, between all the documents that you referenced, including the report on systemic inequities, the analysis of impediments to fair housing that have been done in the past and that we expect to be completed in anticipation of the consolidated plan for the City of Austin, we have about 300-ish recommendations that you can consider on sticky notes that we're spending some time trying to align and come up with some commonalities and see how we can create a good, viable implementation plan that really is implementation of the strategic housing blueprint. That's a number of the recommendations that have come forward, but since adoption of that, we've had a number of other reports, including the report that was just presented today and the People's Plan and the UT study. So we're spending some time trying to kind of come up with an approach that would allow us to tackle all of these things in an integrated and comprehensive way. And we anticipate bringing that back to the Housing and Planning Committee at their February meeting. And that's going to include an implementation plan for the $250 million general obligation bonds. It's going to include what we anticipate is going to be additional staffing that we will need to be able to accomplish all of this in the timeframes that have been allocated. We're very excited to have all of this information that's before us and to have the opportunity to take what is a lot of great ideas and work to, with the community's help, translate these into some actionable plans that will really help the affordable housing and displacement and gentrification issues that the community is facing.
Okay. Thank you. Greg?
I'd like to thank, first of all, everybody for participating and all of your organizations for coming together in this work. And also thanks for y'all's strong recommendation on the housing bond. That it was a big gamble for, I think, everybody on the dais to put such a bold figure out there, but I think the community really responded, and so thank y'all for your urging in that respect. And now we can go and do the right thing. Some of the big takeaways I took from this were that there are many of these items that we haven't been doing for too long, but many of them that we're starting to actually work on. I was really pleased to flip through this and see that many of the things that y'all were bringing up have recently been sponsored by a variety of members. I don't have to go through them, but I do think that it's important to start acknowledging that while too long plans have sat on the shelf and there's been too long of lists of things we haven't done, that when you flip through this, there actually are a number of these things that where the council and the staff started picking them up as you were working on them. And so I think that's an important shift. I also appreciate that you'll have recommendations on homeowners and on renters, because while so often, as the council member Alvarez mentioned, we have focused on homeownership, which is really important, and we want more black and brown homeownership in the city. As it stands right now, I was just looking at the demographer's data, 75% of African Americans in Austin rent right now, and over 68% or 67% of Latinos do. So we can't be talking about gentrification and displacement and ignoring renters if that's, 3/4 of or 2/3 of communities of color in the city right now. So creating homeownership opportunities is important, and we need to do it, but we have to be able to talk about both, and I appreciate y'all really highlighting both in the report. I also just want to, now that we have the staffing in place, to start looking at doing affordable housing development in places like the Crestview Station in Councilmember Poole's district and the St. John property in mine. I just want to highlight that we have a real opportunity to show off a lot of these policies and how we can do it right on some of these pieces of public land. Just thinking about that Home Depot property, speaking for myself and my own district, I mean, y'all talk about developing affordable housing on public land. You talk about using some of our tax abatement and tax exemptions that we haven't used in the past for affordable housing. We can do these sorts of things on these pieces of property. Right to return, right to remain policies to bring people back to a historic neighborhood like that one. I think we have such an opportunity to do that in one concentrated piece of property while complying with fair housing laws. But I just think that there's definitely a way that we can do that and utilize the bonds and make sure that new housing has a lot of the tenants' rights expansions that y'all have studied and recommended here. And so I'm excited. We can try to do as many of these things as we can citywide, but I think that we have such an opportunity on some of these pieces of public property to show what it looks like if we do 8 or 9 or 10 of these recommendations in some of these targeted areas in ways that maybe we should have been doing for a long time, but we are where we are now, and I think we just have. I really take this as a good charge of how can we ask our staff as we embark on redeveloping some of this property for affordable housing to say how many of these things can we do on this one piece of property? How many of these things can we do in conjunction with the housing bond spending? So thank you all for sort of having a long laundry list, because even though so many times people say, well, it's just so long, how are we going to do it all? I think we do have to do many of these things. So I really appreciate it and look forward to sort of bringing this back up as we do the work with the housing bond and with the redevelopment of that land. So thank you.
Yeah, and I think, there are those things where I think that are already kind of being pursued, right? Because again, there's a lot of things that are emerging as we were doing our work. But I do think that one of them is, or a couple of them, I guess one is, when we look at our resources, right? Whether it's the land that we control or the funding that we have for housing or the density bonus approach, is that how do we get a variety of levels of affordability, right? Deeper affordability, especially, but also then long-term affordability, right? Because I know we've had that issue in the past where we lose large numbers of affordable, especially rental units. And I know one of the recommendations that I know the city's already investigating is the kind of the rental registry, so that we know where are the units and for how much longer are they going to be affordable, so that we don't get to the point where we're 2 or 3 years out of losing a couple hundred units and there's not enough time to really figure out how to extend that affordability. And so I think some of those things I know the city is already pursuing, and just based on our conversations, but I do think that those are, I think, some good points and overarching issues that I think came up on both the rental and home ownership side.
And I think oftentimes folks, because sometimes we develop affordable housing that looks really good, folks, I think, sometimes have a misconception. We saw it on the campaign trail with the housing bond that we're spending affordable housing rental dollars on high-income rental units, and legally it's just an important reminder for everyone that we can't spend bond dollars subsidizing rental units unless it's people making less than 50% of median family income. So this is, and 50%, that means that's the very top. So that means we're helping folks at 30 and 40% MFI with these bond dollars. And I think it's just important for folks to understand that, because I constantly hear it repeated that these rental units are going to families with $85,000 incomes, and that just isn't the case. And so I think it's just important for folks to be reminded of that.
Ms. Houston.
Thank you, Mayor. Please convey my thanks to the members of the task force. I think they did an incredible job. It saddens my heart in a way that 40 years later we might start moving on some of this, and that people have been talking about what's happened to most of my community for 40 years. And so it's my prayer that this will begin to make some changes in how people live and where people have the opportunity to live in the city of Austin. So thank you all for doing that. I do want to make one minor correction to the members of the task force. Yvette Crawford Lee lived in District 1 in her parents' home until she could no longer afford the taxes, and so she moved to Pflugerville, and so she was my appointee, not the mayor's. I'm not sure how that got confused, but her dad was a lawyer here in town, and her mother was a wonderful musician, and they live on Stafford Street. The house is still there, but she's no longer able to live there because of the property taxes.
Okay. Thank you very much for the work. Is there anything else, Mayor Pro Tem?
Yeah, I just wanted to extend my thanks too. I think you've done really just a remarkable job of synthesizing recommendations from other reports, and you have provided, I think, additional affirmation for some ideas and recommendations that other groups have suggested, and even that the council has initiated and taken action on. But you've also identified some new strategies or some strategies from other places that weren't yet in the consideration, and so I think this is going to be extremely valuable. And I understand, and I actually had an opportunity to talk with the city manager yesterday about some of those resolutions and some of the work that we had initiated, including the right to return, which I see is identified as number one, and that is, I'm extremely eager. I think we've gotten lots of feedback from the community that they would like to see a preference policy. We've passed a recommendation, and so I hope that as we move into that conversation in the new year, that there will be priority placed on those recommendations where the council has taken action to say, please create such a policy. We've gotten community support and community groups who have done the same, because I think it is really, as several of my colleagues have said, we're all very eager to take action. And I can address this after, but there are some pending resolutions for which I'm not sure where the action is. And one is the resolution that we passed to look into the potential of having a mortgage assistance program, which I think could get at some of what is contemplated, though not all of what is contemplated under the recommendation related to tax exemptions, kind of on an emergency basis. And so I look forward to revisiting that. And then I guess lastly, I would like to suggest, because the work of the council has been so integrated and so focused on housing and these issues, and we've passed multiple resolutions, I would like to suggest that perhaps that presentation in February be at full council, so that all of us can engage in that conversation. I think it is really critical, and we've already, many of us who don't serve on the committee are already invested and have moved action in these areas. But I thank you so very much again for all of the work. It's really so. I think we had a conversation about how this task force could advance the work, and I think you have really just provided such valuable plan for us. So thanks.
And I did want to just add, Mayor Pro Tem, that when we do come back, be it at the full council or the housing committee first, we will be including updates on all of the pending resolutions. There are a number of them, and they're all incorporated into the our master list of recommendations, so to speak. So there will be updates that will be coming forward on those, if not sooner.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much. I think that there's going to be, Rosie, a huge
Shift.
anticipation in the community when you come back in February for that, both to see the kinds of recommendations that you make and the priority that you set, but also the speed at which we're going to be able to implement things and start moving forward. There was the manager, response that we did with respect to the displacement. There was, again, one of the directions from council that was saying, please look at the immediacy and the urgency of implementation of these kinds of things the same way we looked at trying to get into the ground very quickly on the mobility bond, where we were able to move towards sidewalks and other things that could be happening in the community very rapidly, and I think the expectation is going to be similar for this. Yes, Ann.
I have a question that it doesn't need to be answered right now, but maybe city manager or you all can come back to us with that. With the passage of our bonds, we put language in the resolution about the bonds for a report back to council within 90 days of passage of the bonds. And the purpose of that report was to bring forward, and I don't remember all the language, but basically to bring forward the implementation timeline and that sort of thing. So I am going to want to, I'm wanting to understand the timing of all these various pieces. So perhaps it would be helpful, City Manager, if you guys could come up with a timeline for us, because we've got the implementation for a range of bonds through what we just passed. We've also got implementation of the corridor plans and the other 2016 mobility bonds. That's coming back to us too, and we've got interconnections between all of these. So that would be helpful to have some kind of timeline, so we understand that. Also, I think it is important to have these conversations at multiple levels. So I think it's important to use our committees to have conversations where we can delve into much more detail because we have more time, but to also use the work sessions. And so we've got the same thing going on with with mobility and transportation, because we have mobility bonds and a range of mobility planning that's coming back to us, where we're thinking in terms of delving into great detail in our committee, but then also, the broader pictures will be brought back to the full work session. So I don't think it's an either-or between the committees and the work session.
Mayor.
Okay. In fact, I think it's already shown up on the agenda for the Housing Committee in February.
Correct.
Okay. Then it's being planned to come to the Housing Committee in February. Pio.
Yes, I really want to thank y'all for that report, but, it seemed like a lot of these recommendations is going to be, you're going to require some state assistance or legislation. So, I'm very concerned because we're starting our legislation season here in January when they come back and meet. And some of these recommendations they're very exciting. I mean, especially with the senior homestead exemptions and these kind of recommendations for seniors, low-income seniors. But it seems like we're going to have to make recommendations, and if we do, then it probably won't happen until 2 years from now unless we could get it going really quickly and have our lobbyists lobbying for these type of programs and support.
And we will. I just made note to make sure that we have an opportunity before we come in February to have some conversations with our government relations office to see if there's anything on here that get their perspective on things that would require legislative change.
Great. I'm glad you're already working on that.
Yes, Liz.
In listening to all of the questions and stuff, and a great overview. Thank you so much, Raul, and for all the folks who are on the committee. I really, really appreciate the work that you guys did and staff did as well. I have been musing a bit about the transfer of wealth that can happen, and I put wealth in kind of quotes because it may or may not be wealth to somebody else. But historically, if you have been able as a family to buy your home and the property that it's on, you've been able to hold on to that and pay the taxes and have your taxes frozen when you reach 65 or whatever the programs are available to you. And then if you pass that along to the next generation, then the protections that have been built in once you reach a senior age go away, and the homestead exemption skyrockets the next year, right? Even if it's in the same family. And I know that has led to a lot of folks who may not have the wherewithal to hold on to a homestead that the prior generation or two has held so dearly and tried to hold on to. And so I also recognize that this is not an area of taxation that the city has a lot or any control over. But when you had your conversations about how to hold on to a property to keep the wealth within a family without being then taxed through estate taxes and everything, so that you end up having to sell in order to make good on whatever the new taxes are, did that enter into any of the conversations that you all had? And if so, did you have any thoughts about that may or may not have appeared in this document because of the limitations for a municipality?
I mean, I think so, in the sense that one of the things we advocate for is kind of an Office of Housing Stability, to get back at that community engagement piece. How do we engage with families, right? To find out what kind of help they need and to find out what resources are available. But I think one of the things when the UT group was doing their research, and I don't know if it ended up in their research, is with that very issue of when there's a senior who owns a home who passes on, and then the property kind of passes on to a family member, that immediately goes to market rate. And so some of the research Heather had done and her team was that there's a way of actually putting something in place so that when someone else in the family, right, takes over the property, they can immediately at least have their homestead exemption on it. So I think that's part of the reason kind of we need, like, I think a vehicle, right, by which to have all this knowledge being able to be imparted, right, to people who need help, and for people to know there's an office or a number I can call to get help. It's probably easier said than done, right, than when you're talking FTEs, but we do think that that's part of the challenge. Is there are some tools available that not everybody is using, so how do we help them with that? And then also, again, how to identify the gaps or things maybe that we think are not possible that are possible that, again, we can then impart, through that vehicle. But I think that's one of the, there's several bodies that we kind of asked to be created, one around this, one around sort of public oversight of public land trust or community land trust, right, for a variety of reasons that are articulated in the report, and also maybe some kind of oversight of public or advisory on the bonds, right? How do we get folks involved in some way in kind of the decision making that goes into kind of some of these very important elements that don't exist and we know need to happen, but what's the best way? Is it an FTE? Is it an office? Can they be combined in some way? I think that's one of the challenges, but I do think we have tried to think of those things, where there are tools that we didn't know of, and how do we then let people know about them?
Well, it also occurs to me, and maybe Ms. Jackman, you could respond to this, if we do proceed with the concept of the land trust and are able to get some families into that, maybe we could also have an element of that be some kind of a 5-year lookout where maybe the family wasn't able to do much planning for that handoff because maybe there was an illness and nobody was thinking of the future. They were really just focused on the present. And the city could possibly help maybe with helping to underwrite some of the taxes that would come due so that it might allow a family who may be participating in another program to hold on to that homestead longer until they can get their ducks in a row, so to speak, and then be able to take on whatever the additional burden may be for the taxation, where the city may offer a helping hand to get over a time and financial hurdle where the end result goal would be that family in that homestead would be able to handle it going forward. Just a thought.
Yeah. Now, those are some of the most of the conversations that I have had with community members, since there are many older people who still have their homes in Central East Austin, the area where I am located. But we did not, there was nothing that we knew of, the groups that, on the task force, that we could come up with any recommendations to answer that in a transfer of wealth. There was nothing that we came up with, so.
Thank you. Ms. Houston, is your light on?
Yes,
you want
sir.
to speak? Sorry, Ms. Houston, go ahead. And then Day, and then Jimmy.
Again, thank you for this conversation, because as you said, most of the elders, my seniors, this has been a pressing issue for them for years, as that how do they pass that opportunity for wealth on to the next generation. And some people might not want that, but for those that do, they don't have an opportunity. I know people get tired of hearing about my taxes, but I just got them the other day, and so I know that my homestead, because I'm over 65 and the homestead, this year it went up to $6,600 some dollars that I need to pay by the end of December. And I asked them, I went out to the tax appraisal district to ask them, so what if I die and my kids now inherit the homestead, what would they pay? Almost $11,000. And neither one of my children make that kind of money to be able to afford that. So without the homestead exemption and without the over 65, which is the major one, over 65, because AISD property taxes are capped at over $3,000, they wouldn't be able to stay in the home that their grandparents built that passed down to me that I was going to try to pass down. So that's a real issue for many seniors in not only my community but the Hispanic community who are trying to stay there in the community as well. But I wanted to ask, this question was to about the land, the city land that we're owning, buying, and you got an email yesterday about Austin Housing Finance Corporation, because I think we all think that that's city-owned land, but that's a different portfolio. So if you could include in that the same thing, that we asked for, Mayor Pro Tem and I asked if you could give that to everybody on the council so we know what your portfolio in the Austin Housing Finance Corporation is and what plans you may have for use of that land.
Absolutely.
Delia.
This was just to piggyback off the transfer of wealth concern, and I think you guys did make some recommendations to provide some tools for that. And so one is support the ability of low-income homeowners to build an accessory dwelling unit by easing land restrictions. That's something that the city can do. So if an elderly person wants to pass on that property to somebody else, they could the one right after that is just be able to subdivide the lot. So they can remain in place and then generate sale from the additional lot, as well as reduce the tax obligation for their homestead, because we know that much of the value is in the land. And so while we have limited ability to address how taxing entities, what they value properties at and that kind of thing, there are some abilities in here that some of us have been working on to ease land restrictions, especially when we have arbitrary numbers for lot sizes and saying whether you can or cannot, get the most out of your property. I think is something that would really help people. And I think one of the members of the task force has told me stories about he can't afford to buy in East Austin, but his mother lives there, and if he would love to be able to build an accessory dwelling unit behind his mom's house so he can live in East Austin. So I think there's a lot of good information here that builds on work that we're doing. So thank you.
Let's do Jimmy, and then we'll go to the Water Forward report.
Thank you, Councilmember Garza. That was much of what I was also thinking. The notion of kind of longitudinal wealth over many generations is a really thorny one. I'm not entirely sure what our responsibility is to that. That's different than displacement. It's not the same thing. It's an issue, but it's not displacement. Councilmember Garza noted a couple of recommendations that might allow people to stay in their community, the way Councilmember Houston phrased it. I really like that phrasing. But there's also one that is counter to that, number 37, that says there shouldn't be any increased density in areas having degrees of gentrification. Well, that would counter the ability for folks to build ADUs. It would actually ensure gentrification, because then only the next wealthy family could buy that house. So I have some concerns with some of these. I think it's a really impressive document and a lot of very hard work the task force put together. But we have some difficult decisions to make as a city, and they're not as simple as we've allowed the conversations to be. I'll just leave it at that.
All right, thank you very much
if,
for the report.
To speak just briefly, I mean, I do think that's one of the things we struggled with, right? Is because of the differing views on that, and you highlighted sort of an inconsistency, which I don't see as an inconsistency, because I'm more worried about the projects that are, not adding an ADU, but the ones that are going 70 units an acre, 100 units an acre, and what that's having in terms of the setting land values, which is sort of the crux of why people are being displaced, right? It's because of ever-increasing land values. And so I think that's where it's like, especially in areas like in the UT report that are identified as, gentrifying or displacement, right? Experiencing displacement are there different ways of treating those areas, right? Whether it's through our current code, through the next code, But just making sure that we're thinking about that, right? Regardless of whatever we're passing in terms of code changes or regulations, is making sure we're cognizant of the impact that it could have, right, on displacement. And then we're going to have a healthy debate about what the right thresholds are, I think. But
And I think the land value one requires more investigation, because I remember getting a presentation from the Travis County tax assessor maybe the first couple of months I was here, where she said that she only compares homesteads to homesteads. She doesn't compare homesteads to those 70 units an acre. So I don't know that it's as clear that allowing that necessarily drives up home prices and homesteads. I think it's far more complicated and imperfect a process that the tax assessor is forced to comply with. But I think it's a lot more complicated than any new development necessarily blows up all the values surrounding it, because that's not consistent with what we heard the tax assessor say last year. But a lot more work to be done in breaking that puzzle apart to understand it better.
Great. Thank you so very much for the time, and to the task force as well. Thank you.